Good evening, everyone. My name is David Eichenthal, and welcome to the first of the Tennessee Democracy Forum's Conversations on Democracy. The Tennessee Democracy Forum is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization dedicated to promoting democracy here in the volunteer state. Recently, we've been releasing the results of our first annual Tennessee Democracy Poll, designed to inform debate on a series of issues critical to economic and political democracy. And tonight, to launch our conversations on democracy, I'm really honored to be joined by former Governor Todd Whitman and former Ambassador Norm Eisen. Both Governor Whitman and Ambassador Eisen have long and distinguished careers in public service, and they've come together as part of a bipartisan effort as co-chairs of the States United Democracy Center and States United Action. And we'll spend the bulk of this evening with them over the course of the next hour talking about those efforts. Some very quick ground rules for this evening. There are over 100 people participating in the conversation tonight. For those of you familiar with Zoom, you'll find a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You could ask questions throughout the program this evening by using that function of Zoom. And as we see the questions mount up, we'll move to some of those before we conclude the discussion at the hour. Before we start this evening, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the events in Uvalde, Texas this week. I know that all of us participating tonight are really horrified by the school shooting there. We thought about perhaps postponing tonight's discussion, but as the nation grapples with the need to respond, we ultimately decided that taking the time to talk about democracy was very important, because part of the test of a democracy is precisely how it responds to challenges like the crisis of violence in our nation. So with that, let's get going. Governor Whitman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I wanted to talk to you first about some of the results of the poll that we released last week that looked at Tennesseans' views on what happened last January 6th. And what we found in the polling was that when you account for the margin of error, there's pretty much a 50-50 divide in Tennessee as to whether what occurred at the Capitol was an insurrection or was, as some have suggested, a form of legitimate political protest. I know I read an interview that you gave earlier this year where you talked about how troubling January 6th was to you. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how January 6th affected you, how it affected your decision to get involved in these various pro-democracy efforts, and really what you would say to some Tennesseans that do think that there really wasn't anything very different about what happened on January 6th from other forms of political protest.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the Tennessee Democracy Forum for doing this. I appreciate it, and it is a tough time for all of us with what happened recently in Texas. I mean, that's heartbreaking, and it does call on us to come together as members of a democracy to decide one way or the other how we want to try to handle these things going forward, so we don't have to deal with them every day, and the trauma doesn't have to be so widespread. But you know, January 6th, I think there were a group of people certainly who went there just to protest and thought it was a legitimate way of protesting. But to me, it was all my worst fears. Once they got to the Capitol and started to breach the Capitol itself, that was a whole different type of a movement. That wasn't just a peaceful protest. That was a serious attempt. When you listen to what they were saying, what they were chanting, it was a serious attempt to overthrow our election. And it was a culmination of things that I think all of us, or a number of us, certainly Norm and I and Joanna, who runs really the State's Democracy Center, what all of us have been seeing happen and we're worrying about is this trend to seed uncertainty with the general population about the security of our elections. I mean, we should be celebrating. The 2020 election was safe, secure, and accurate. And we've seen that over and over again, proven in numerous court cases, over 70 of them, that all of but one, which wouldn't have affected the outcome of that particular state's election, all were thrown out because there was no there. And this idea that you've got to resort to that kind of violence. I mean, when you're hitting policemen over the head, when you're breaking windows, when you're chanting "Hang Mike Pence," going after the speaker, that's not how we handle the transition in government in the United States. And so I was more than delighted when someone reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in joining Norm and Joanna in this effort, because it is so crucial to protect our democracy and the rule of law, and to respect the peaceful transition that we've always enjoyed, that set this country apart from all others. I mean, that's one of the things that's so unique about this country. And so everybody's had to get in on this. We all have to work to try to protect our democracy because it's ours and it's up to us. So I was delighted to be part of it. But January 6th, as I say, maybe in front of the White House, that was certainly the freedom to express yourself, and that was fine. But when you start to resort to violence, that takes it to a whole nother level.
Thank you. Ambassador Eisen, we're focused on Tennessee tonight, but as I think I've mentioned to you, I'm sitting here in Chattanooga. I could look out from my back porch and see Representative Taylor Greene's district from there on a clear day. So we see a lot in our local news coverage about what's going on in Georgia. And obviously there was a primary in Georgia 2 days ago. Looking at the results of that primary, particularly the primary race for Secretary of State, tell me what you see as some of the important takeaways from that election when it comes to democracy.
With pleasure, David. I want to thank you and the Tennessee Democracy Forum for having us, the States United co-chairs, to kick off your series. I want to thank Christy for picking up the phone when I called in the summer of 2020 as the storms were gathering. If you squint really hard there, go out to your porch and squint, you'll see me. I'm here in Marietta, Georgia tonight. So I'll give you a wave at some point. It's a little overcast. I don't know if you'll be able to spot me. Very honored to be here to talk about what's transpired in our democracy, the challenges that we face, and where we go from here. There is a very profound question. I just wrote for CNN, here to do some, of course, CNN, proud Atlanta brand. I just had an op-ed for them, where I'm a commentator, trying to make sense of the Georgia results. And, it was, it is one of the glass half empty, glass half full debates, the outcome of the Tuesday primary. Both Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who defeated his opponent, the Trump Revenge Tour certified election denier, Jody Heiss. Everyone thought it was going to go to a recount, and Raffensperger managed to get 52% of the vote, dodging the 50% recount threshold, barely by 2 percentage points, with Heiss in the 30s. So it was a handy win and a dodge of the recount that everyone thought was coming. The fact that, and then there were other other races on the ballot that also, I have a new book out, as you know, Overcoming Trumpery, How to Restore Ethics, Rule of Law, and Democracy. And we talk a lot about democracy issues in that book, myself and my co-authors. Trumpery, which is the philosophy, Trump's philosophy of governance, including his attack on democracy, as we were chatting about while waiting to come on the Zoom, was on the ballot in Georgia on Tuesday night. And it's not just individuals like Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, in the district, Chattanooga, where you are, as you informed us, is the largest media market in the representatives district. But statewide, Raffensperger, Herschel Walker running for U.S. Senate, it was an election denier. Of course, the former Senator David Perdue was running as a adherent of Trumpery and a full-on election denier against Kemp, and Kemp was successful. I'm sorry to say that although they did their jobs in 2020, we require more than simply doing your job to define political heroism. Raffensperger, like Kemp, has a long and controversial history of voter suppression. So he's not, prior to, and I deeply appreciate that he didn't cave in to the election denial. And of course, we take no position on particular races at States United. But I think if you look, I actually wrote for CNN about the details of Kemp's history of vote suppression. It was while it was welcome that Kemp and Raffensperger defeated terrible election denial, democracy denial candidates, I do not think that either of them, in their long histories, that Kemp was Secretary of State before Raffensperger, are models of the kind of bipartisan, and there are models, including ones who are far more conservative than Mr. Raffensperger, like Stephen Risher in Maricopa County, Arizona. There are models, right, left, and center, for outstanding election administration. But unfortunately, Kemp and Raffensperger, while better than the candidates they defeated, have a history of vote suppression.
Well, in this whole issue of election now, right? I mean, I've been around politics and government for most of my adult life, and I've participated in campaigns where you win and participated in campaigns where you lose. And, Governor Whitman, as you said, the whole peaceful transition of power is the one thing that we've come to expect. I mean, one of the other things that we found in our polling is, much as there's this near 50-50 split among Tennessee voters about what happened on January 6th, there's a similar split when you ask them what, to me was a basic question of who's the president of the United States, right? So about 44 or 45% of the voters said that it was Joe Biden, and about 44 or 45% said that it was Donald Trump. Actually, to me, the most interesting result was that there were about 11% of the people who said they were unsure, which says something. I mean, what do we do about this, right? I mean, what do we do to make sure that the overwhelming majority of voters actually believe in the results of an election, which Governor Whitman, as you said, was fair. There were no irregularities. Beyond that, there was a massive turnout, which I think is a good thing for democracy. What are the steps that folks who are listening in this evening could or should be taking to actually make sure that that confidence gets restored, so that we aren't seeing these sorts of results when we do polling in Tennessee?
Well, David, first of all, you have to step back and remember this is part of a concerted effort that's been going on since before 2016. Donald Trump was talking even before then about elections being unfair and you have to watch out for them. There's always going to be problems. Of course, it was only when Republicans lost, not when they won. Somehow we saw it in Arizona in 2020 when they were going after the ballots and doing their fourth recount. I mean, somehow at that point they were looking for bamboo in the ballots because somehow China had figured out the ballots for Donald Trump, but they're all down ballot. Republicans won. I say, now that was really clever to be able to fix just the top level. But this is part of a coordinated attack on our democracy. It's been going on now, as I said, for years, trying to undermine the public's confidence in our electoral process. And so it's no wonder people are starting to get confused because they've been hearing it over and over again. And now it's become even more organized. It's you change the rules or the laws governing your elections. So you change the people who are overseeing them or the referees so that you can change the outcome. So that anytime your side doesn't win, and this unfortunately, as a Republican, I'm saying is mostly the Republican side we've seen, you can claim foul. And we have states now that are actually passing legislation that would take oversight of the elections away from the people who are trained to do it, which is the secretaries of states in most states. They vary from state to state, the power of a secretary of state or a state's attorney general, and taking it away from them and put it into the hands of partisan politicals. And that's just wrong. I mean, the interesting thing we at States United have found is that a vast majority, some 77% of the American people would rather see that every legitimate vote is counted than have their own candidate win. I mean, people care about that. So what we have to do is remind people of the importance of the ballot. This last election cycle, as you said, in Georgia, they had an extraordinary turnout, particularly in early voting. I think it was a little bit kind of like that to those who were saying that we're going to suppress the vote. You're not going to. We're going to get out there and vote, which is great. Both sides, more Republicans actually than Democrats in that election. But what we have to do is remind people it matters who your Secretary of State is. It matters who your Attorney General is, because while elections may be national in scope, the way people talk about them, they're handled by the states. And it's the states that set the rules. It's the states that oversee them. And so what we do at States United, we just put out lists of these deniers. And a denier is someone who is continues to question the results of the 2020 election, was there on January 6th, might continue to be posting questions about it, believes that January 6th was just another day at the Capitol. And though if they're an election denier and say, okay, understand this is who this is. Do you want people who don't trust the system, who don't believe in the system, overseeing the system? It's up to you. If you want to do that, that's fine, but you ought to know who these people are. And that's what we have to do. We have to get the American people, we have to get them in every state, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, it doesn't matter. They have to pay attention. They have to vote in primaries because they are terribly important. And they need to understand when they're the anti-democracy people who are in control. Do you really want them to be the ones who are making the decisions? Because you know what, as we've seen so often in history, it might be just great when they're your people, but what happens when the tide turns? Do you really want people who don't observe the rule of law or uphold the Constitution?
Ambassador Eisen, on this same question, right, I had a friend of mine, asked me recently, isn't there something that our government in other places, right, sort of spreads the news about democracy? Isn't there some way that part of this is almost a campaign, right? And I think you're doing it, obviously, and Governor Whitman's doing it, and what you're doing now, but it's getting as many people to speak out about, why this is important as possible. But is that enough to overcome, what the governor referred to as sort of this many years built up of people putting doubt in the minds of Americans?
Well, there's a third person who's doing it on this screen. That's you, David, by starting the Tennessee Democracy Forum, and your colleagues and every one of the over 100 folks who are joining us tonight. And that's part of the genius of our nation, and part of the reason that it had been since the Civil War, since we had anything other than a peaceful transition of power, and we were able to have ultimately a transition of power, because, and this is what gives me hope, we were tested in 2020, and officials of both parties did do the right things. That was election officials, secretaries of state, governor, canvassing board members. It was judges, those 60 plus cases. There's a lot of debate. Are there 63? Are there 65? Are there 74? Those 60 plus cases where judges, many of them GOP or Trump appointees, did the right thing, and all of it backed up by, in my view, the American people. One of the things that the 2020 election was a great referendum on the direction of our country and the direction of our democracy. The American people chose democracy, and then they reinforce those decisions made by the leaders. That's the American model of a partnership between the public and officials, and in particular, federal officials had an important role to play. Of course, there were some disappointments with over 100, well over 100, who voted in Congress to refuse to certify election results that they fully knew were valid. But on the positive side, in the states, you did see this groundswell of state officials, state and local, of both parties and the people coming together to take us through a moment like we haven't had in modern American history in 2020. That's the model. And that's why things like the Tennessee Democracy Forum are so important. And there's really a role for each and every one of us if we're going to preserve this American experiment. Now, for me and for Christy and our colleagues, now almost 40 strong at States United, this little effort that we started in the summer of 2020 with Joanna Lidgate, our wonderful CEO. For us, the focus is on the state officials, irrespective of party, the pro-democracy state officials, because they are so important. They were the keys to get us through 2020. And that's why we work so much with them and have a whole organization that is devoted to supporting their efforts and letting everyone know the great things that they're doing.
Let me ask you both a question. It's a question that's come into me over the chat. It's actually from Logan Washburn, who's a reporter at the Tennessean, and he asks, going back to I think what Governor Whitman was talking about, where the sort of underlying concerns over the validity of the election are coming from, right? So again, Ambassador Eisen, to take your 60 plus number, right? There were all of these legal challenges to the election. I guess all but one of them, and the one that didn't fail was, I guess, on a minor set of issues in some of the counting in Pennsylvania.
It certainly didn't embrace fraud.
Right.
There was no finding. Right. It was a minor procedural issue.
So and Governor, you talked about the fact that this has been built up over time, but clearly those people who are sowing doubt in the process are exploiting, right, some sort of undercurrent that's out there among what seems to be about half the voters in Tennessee. What are those sorts of underlying concerns, and how do we begin to address those?
Well, I think part of it came from a frustration because for so long, Congress seemed to have been doing nothing. I mean, yes, they were passing things, but it has gotten so partisan that every issue now is looked at through that partisan political prism rather than the policy one. So instead of saying what's going to be the best policy for the country, it's what's going to keep me in power, what's going to get me another vote in my district. And that's where we, the people, have to become more engaged. That's where we make the difference in saying, hey, you know what? No, we don't like this behavior. No, this is the issue about which we care the most. This is what we want you to act on. We want you to get something done. But they weren't seeing that. And so people were feeling they were left behind. Nobody was listening to their issues. And so they were angry and mad. And I get that. And they acted out. And I think now a number of them have gotten so, they bought into it so deeply that it's hard to now step back and say, gee, I think I was wrong. That really the election was fine. They have now been convinced that it's okay to say, if we don't win, it was fraud and we should do something about it. And that's been part of the rhetoric that's been going on. And unfortunately, I do lay a lot of it, the blame for that and the rhetoric at the former president for the way he has handled things. But again, what Norm said is so true. The 2020 election, we saw members of both parties and we saw the American public stand up. First of all, they voted in extraordinary numbers in the middle of a pandemic, where voting things changed all the time about how you could vote, where you could vote, early voting, all that sort of thing. People didn't know because of the pandemic, but they turned out, they voted, they wanted to be heard. And then you had election officials from both sides of the aisle who stood up and pushed back against these deniers. And that's what held. And we think that we're building on that. And by having these kinds of forums, by all of us getting out as much as we can to speak to people, to say, look, we understand you can be frustrated, you can be angry, you can think we're not living up to our best standards. That's fine. But this isn't about Republican or Democrat. This is about democracy. It's about the way we handle our governance in this country. And, you know, if you know history, you know, democracies are not long-lived. You look at Greece, you look at Rome, and so we're pushing the edges of what democracies and how they've survived. And we need to understand it's fragile. Benjamin Franklin said it either when he was leaving the Continental Congress or when he was at a dinner table with a lady. Who knows when he really said it or if he really did, but it works. That when asked what kind of a government they'd given us, it was a republic if you can keep it. And I think that if you can keep it is the part that resonates now. And we have got to really let people know it's about, can you keep it? And we have to keep it. And that's up to us, each and every one of us. And I think we're getting through. I think I believe we've seen more. We certainly are getting more of public attention through the media. It's still not where it needs to be. It hasn't convinced everybody. And there's some that you're just never, ever going to convince. But I do believe that number is going down.
I would just like to add that having studied the life of Franklin as an amateur historian, I bet it was at the table with the lady.
Yeah, I think it probably was.
That he said that's my bet. I'll just add to that the trajectory of where it comes from in response to Logan's concerns. You know, there's a long it's been a building history. It's a challenge in American history, and ours is one of triumph. I am the child of immigrants, and I'm proud of our history, but we have a long-standing struggle to extend the franchise to everyone in this country. And we have seen a resurgence. I saw it when I worked in the White House of issues of race-based denial of the franchise. And I don't think you can ignore the racial elements, particularly talking as we are, me in Georgia, you next to your front porch, David, in Tennessee. I think we have to talk about that. That, by the way, is by no means an issue confined to the South. And That's number one. So those are election protection and voter suppression issues. That's why I think we have to be candid about continuing efforts, like the terrible legislation here in Georgia that would prevent me from giving a bottle of water to an elderly voter waiting in a long line. By the way, those long lines are disproportionately in minority districts. That's number one. Number two, I agree with Christie, agree with the governor, the failure of accountability. We have not held Trump accountable, the former president, for so much misbehavior, and that has created a climate of impunity that has directly led to this big lie campaign. We are seeing consequences. He's not running the table like many thought he would. So that again is reassuring that there are, cases where others in Christie's party and in the GOP electorate are standing up to him. But accountability and impunity, I think we have to talk about the threat of political violence that has, the rhetoric where it's coming from. There's an acceptability, and that brings us back to the excess of violence. In my view, the excess of availability of guns and other weaponry, like some of the implements that were used on January 6th, and of course the terrible Texas, the Uvalde situation that you began with, that is just tearing all our hearts this week. And then finally, I would point to the role of disinformation. So much false, and again, a culture, it's not all false election disinformation. You have a president, and it may surprise you to know I worked on his transition. I was not a never Trumper. I volunteered, I was helpful to his transition before he took a turn that I found unacceptable. But when you have a president who traffics in falsehood, 30,000 lies by the measure of the Washington Post, and a climate of so many falsehoods, practicing with saying Obama was not born in America, was not an American. That truther, that was the template for this election trutherism. Coincidentally, those four areas, countering voter suppression with election protection, countering impunity with accountability, addressing political violence, and getting the truth out there to combat disinformation, those are the four areas that Christie and I and our almost 40 colleagues and growing at States United work on every day. Those are our four areas of emphasis, and we'd like to see more. We work always bipartisan, everything we do, like Noah's Ark, a conservative and a liberal, a D and an R, and we'd like to see more of that. To go back to where the governor started, I do think the failure is also a failure of friendship, to be able to reach a hand across the aisle and work together. It's part of the reason that I volunteered for the Trump transition way back when, before I was disillusioned.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. It's from Stephen Culp. It's a great question, and actually turns to an area that I was going to raise with you both. So we've talked about national elections, state elections in Georgia. Let me ask you a question about a recent local election here in Tennessee, actually here in Hamilton County. We had our primary election here in Hamilton County at the beginning of this month for county mayor. There was only one Democrat running for county mayor. By the way, in Tennessee, we have county mayors, not county executives, because as someone once told me, the legislature decided that everybody should have at least one mayor they like. So we have county mayors here in Tennessee. There was one Democrat who is running, so there was no competitive primary. There were three candidates in the Republican primary. Two of the three were unable to state who they thought the president of the United States was. One of the Republican candidates, Weston Wamp, said that Joe Biden won the election. And Weston Wamp won that primary with somewhere under 40% of the vote, no runoff here in the county mayor's race. That result, which I think was about a 300 vote margin countywide, has now been challenged by his two Republican opponents in the race. And they have argued that there were a disproportionate number of Democratic voters who crossed over in the open primary, and that's what put Mr. Wamp into the nomination. I think the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has suggested something slightly similar in the Secretary of State race, not that Secretary of State Raffensperger won because of crossover votes, but may have avoided the runoff as you suggested. So I guess the question that's posed is, are open primaries a way to sort of combat anti-democracy Republicans, or are they just going to be the next battleground for Republican-controlled state legislatures to act on?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you have open primaries, I don't know how anyone can challenge the fact that people vote, they cross over. That's an open primary. I'm all for them because they force candidates to talk to people just outside of their party. The problem that we have now is that everybody, especially in primaries, just focuses on their quote unquote base. And for each party, that tends to get more extreme. When you have only, up until recently, the last couple of cycles, the average voter turnout in a primary was 10%, which is just pathetic. And those are the most partisan people then, and they tend to be more on the extreme, and that builds on itself over time. So open primaries are a way to deal with that. There are a lot of ways now that we see that you can have, and when you get to a general election, you can have first across the post, you can have ranked choice voting. There are a lot of different ways to try to ensure that candidates have to reach out to more than just their quote unquote base, because when they're just doing their base, and particularly in primaries, they are going to be as extreme as they think they need to be, because it tends, as we've seen from where the turnout, it's the more extreme people who will be guaranteed to vote. And so when you have something like an open primary, and I wish we had that here, we do have the ability to change your registration, but you have to do it a month ahead of time. You have to announce it and make that decision a month ahead of time. You can't walk into the polls and say, I want a Democrat ballot or I want a Republican ballot. I think that's a healthy thing, frankly. And with all due respect to those who worry about one party being taken over by the other, none of them are that organized that they'd be able to carry that out for any long extended period of time to get people to figure that one out. So I don't worry about that. I think it's a way to try to open the dialogue and open the discussions and the issues that are being brought forward. And so that's healthy. But the most important thing is we just want to make sure that we make voting as accessible as possible to everybody who is eligible to vote. And we want full turnouts. I've done enough election observation missions in different parts of the world to see how countries that haven't had the ability to choose their elected officials behave when they get that. And it puts us to shame. We'll look out and say, oh, it's a lovely day, I think I'll play golf. I missed the polls, or it's raining and I don't want to go outside, so I don't want to go to the polls. They'll stand in the rain for literally 6 or 7 hours to get to the polls because it means that much to them. We've just gotten a little lazy. And so anything that we can do to get it to a point where the candidates are actually speaking to a broader constituency than just their own party, because the issues that we face, particularly at the local level, have nothing to do with Republican or Democrat. I mean, if you're talking about paving roads, it's not Republican or Democrat. If you're talking about cleaning the water, it's not Republican water or Democrat water. And just the way what we try to do at States United isn't partisan, it's about democracy.
Yeah, I would add that just as with some of the opinions, my personal view, I don't think we have an organizational position on ranked choice voting or open primaries. We do on wanting voting to be free, fair, and accessible to as many people as possible. Of course, the debate over RCV or open primaries is whether it does or does not achieve that. But I'll say, as I've sprinkled in some of my personal opinion on this one too, that I strongly agree with my co-chair. I love to see open primaries because those officials will end up representing everyone in their electorate. And the primary is a critical part of who you get in the general and who you get in office. That is the American idea. People are not there in office to represent just those who agree with them. They're there to represent everyone and pursue the public interest as they understand it best. So I personally strongly favor. And to answer the question in the chat, we'll see. I think there's a battle going on. The GOP voters and the GOP officials are showing, particularly the voters, are showing a lot of spine in standing up to the efforts to steamroll them. And I do give credit to the voters of Georgia, of both parties, who turned out in such record numbers, despite a new regime intended to make voting more difficult. When did that become American? To make it harder for people to vote with the new Georgia legislative restrictions, the hurdles. But nevertheless, I give the voters of both parties credit, and that is the answer to the question.
I want to be respectful of time. We're coming up on about 15 minutes till our scheduled end, and we're getting a lot of great questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to try and combine some of those. So one of the questions that's out there has to do with the point that both of you raised around disinformation. And I think the specific question is not around disinformation per se, but about sort of the siloed news sources that are out there, right? So I'm old enough to remember that, you know, if you wanted to know what was really happening, you tuned into Walter Cronkite every night, and that was it, right? That was that. There weren't tablets or a mountain involved, but there might as well have been. But now everybody could sort of pick their own source. Are there things that could be done to encourage voters in particular to seek a diversity of opinion in terms of informing them both about candidates who are running for office, but also about, you know, what the outcomes really are of those elections?
Well, of course, I always say to people, look, if you watch Fox News, then go watch NBC. I personally like BBC because they have a more nuanced version of what's happening here in the country. And so, but the point being that you have to get outside your comfort zone and look at both sides. I mean, I do watch Fox 5. It's not always the easiest thing to do. I don't agree with them on a lot of things, and it can drive me nuts, but I try to do that just as to be responsible. If you read the Wall Street Journal, read the Times, read the Washington Post, you know, try to do that, get that diversity. And certainly the internet provides a lot of ways, makes it really easy to pick and choose and find stories that reinforce your already evolved opinion. And that's where people are going. They're going to the sites only that reflect what they want to hear or they want to see. And so it's time to get out of the comfort zone. And that's something that we talk to people about. But, you know, I think the local press they are the best at providing a little more of a balanced view, because they are in their communities, they know their communities, they know their disparate opinions in their communities. So they tend to be a little more balanced. And I think that's a way, particularly when you are looking at local elections, that's the place to go. It's the local reporters who are going to give you a little bit more of both sides, but it's hard. It's one of those challenges. The internet is a wonderful thing, but it can also be a negative.
I'll give a quick shout out to our hometown paper here in Chattanooga. One of the best things about it that I discovered when we moved here about 20 years ago is because it was a merger of two papers, the Times and the Free Press, part of the deal was that each would retain their own editorial page. So when you turn to the editorial pages of the Times Free Press now, you have both literally and figuratively on the left, the Times and the Free Press on the right. And sometimes they disagree and sometimes they agree as well. But
that's fascinating. Christy, that gives, we should start a paper and we can write, because while the governor and I agree on democracy issues, obviously we're coming from different points of political origin. We have different different perspectives, but I love that you open the paper and you get one of each.
That's great.
That is really neat.
I'll
just, after you, Christy, you were going to say something.
But that there was more of that kind of position.
Yeah, that's marvelous. I also watch Fox News for the same reason. David, I'll just add to the very good question that Thomas Powers asked about combating the disinformation in which we are awash, that on the States United side, it is one of those four pillars that I described to you. And the best way you combat disinformation is with truth. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot we can do in working with our wonderful state officials of both parties to get the truth out there. And we have learned how, the tactics. Like, for example, and we say this as part of the service that we provide to share best practices. You can find them all on the States United website. We publish, we're very transparent. For example, don't lift up the disinformation. If you're a public official, we say to our colleagues, and somebody tells a lie, you might be tempted, say on Twitter, to tweet on top of that false statement. Don't do it. You're just amplifying the lie. So there's this, tell the truth, but just refer. Oh, Hank is very kindly, our wonderful States United colleague who's on. We have to give a big shout out to Hank Sparks and Tiger Marr, who worked so hard to help us get ready for this inaugural Tennessee Democracy Forum. So if you look on our website, you'll see those best practices. I know it may seem like a small thing, but just talking as we now have to hundreds, even thousands at this point, of state and local officials of both parties. Hey, here's how you deal with it if there's an election or other lie in your state or county or city. That does have a gradual effect in pushing back on the lies with truth.
So I want to, as we close in on the hour, I want to turn to another topic that has played itself out here in Tennessee over the last couple of months. I know that another area that States United is looking at is the whole issue of redistricting and the problem where legislators appear to be picking their constituents as opposed to constituents picking their legislators. So here in Tennessee, one of the things that we saw in the redistricting around the congressional lines was basically a division of Nashville with the intent of eliminating the seat of one of the longest serving members, maybe the longest serving member of the Tennessee delegation, Jim Cooper. And Congressman Cooper, as a result of the redistricting, decided not to run again with his seat divided across many others. Now, I think partisan gerrymandering is something that we've seen for, almost the history of the Republic, right? But is it getting worse? Are there greater concerns? Does it both reflect and then amplify sort of the polarization and partisanship that we're seeing? And I guess the question is, what can and should we be doing about it? in the next 3 minutes? If you could all answer that in the next 3 minutes, it'd be great.
Governor Whitman led us with a coalition of other governors in filing. Because we are bipartisan, if we saw a gerrymander on either side of the aisle, we spoke up, we filed. You did your wonderful series of briefs with Governor Schwarzenegger. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass it to, we try to be consistent. And we believe that when either party gets too aggressive and transgresses the law, that's not good, irrespective of your leanings. So we've been consistent in principle. Governor?
Yeah, well, we fired, as you mentioned, we filed amicus in North Carolina and Maryland because of their maps there. We worked with this pro bono counsel to Governor Tony Evers in Wisconsin on that redistricting. I mean, we've been very active in that because it's wrong, and it's denying people the ability to have the kind of representation that they deserve, which means someone who, as Norm mentioned before, that serves all the people and not just a small constituency. The voters are supposed to pick their representatives, not the other way around. And we've seen it on both sides of the aisle. Here in New Jersey, it was the Democrat map that got thrown out, but then another Democrat map was accepted. New York State has had a terrible time with their maps. They've gone back and forth again, Democrat. And so it's been Republican and Democrat. Both parties have played this game, and it's not what our forefathers wanted or considered in any way, shape, or form.
And in Maryland, where we filed, that was also a Democratic map that Governor Whitman led, the bipartisan governors speaking out against that. So we try to live that bipartisanship in redistricting in every other area. And I wish you could, it's really woven into the DNA of our organization. I think that's part of the reason that we've grown and prospered and thrived. I know I'm having a great time with Christy as my
board of advisors,
counterpart.
50% Democrat, 50% Republican. I mean, where we see something wrong, we call it out, Republican or Democrat.
Yeah, these are some, they're conservative, but we come together just like the Tennessee Democracy Forum, irrespective of party. We come together around this bundle of ideas that we call democracy that has fueled the American Republic since Ben Franklin had that dinner that we were talking about. And that's part of, I think, the very special contribution, starting with the co-chairs and our great CEO, but across the organization and our boards that we try to make to these issues.
So I want to ask you both one final question, which is, so we're now gradually...
3 seconds to answer on this one, right?
Okay, that's right. Well, wait till you hear the question. I think there are a lot of people, I assume there are a lot of people who are participating this evening because they're worried, right? I mean, I think you both articulated the worry that you had that led to the development of States United. It's very much the reason that we've moved to form the Tennessee Democracy Forum. Are there specific, we're now less than 6 months from the general election for the midterms, and then in 2 years after that, we'll be looking at the general election for 2024. I guess what worries you most about what could potentially happen this November and what could happen in November of 24?
Well, I guess I'm worried at the state and local level that we see of these election deniers get into office, because they are going to change the rules in order to change the outcome, no matter what their voting public votes for, no matter how the votes are counted. If they don't like the results, they can overturn them. And we've seen, oh gosh, Norm, how many is it, that laws, over 23 that have actually been passed?
Mm-hmm. And hundreds that have been introduced
that would take away the oversight of elections from the nonpartisan, bipartisan people who are put in place to oversee and administer them. And then, of course, we have the violence, the threat of violence against those people, and all of that adds up to a very discouraging situation should these people actually win the generals.
I'll just offer for my answer and for our conclusion, the other side of that, which is pushback against some of those bills are making it through, but there's pushback against others, even the ones that make it through. We've seen some of the very worst provisions limited because of the vigorous advocacy of so many of our wonderful and bipartisan state and local officials, the public, our colleagues, not just at States United, but in all of the NGOs, the C3 and C4 groups that work in this space. And, you know, we're seeing some of these election deniers being shown the door in primaries. And you did see that. That is good news in Georgia and elsewhere. Then others are making it through the primaries, like J.D. Vance in Ohio. Come on, he knows better. So we'll see what happens in the general election. And then we have, you know, law enforcement officials, hundreds, thousands of them who are sensitized to these issues of political violence. We're hoping to see progress there, and working on the disinformation, and most of all, getting the band back together. We survived in 2020 when you had a assaulter, democracy assaulter in the White House, attempting to use the levers of power. The January 6th hearings will be important to illuminate exactly what transpired. We'll come together. I'm hopeful. It's tough. It's a challenge, but America rises to a challenge. And I'm hopeful, as tough as it is, that we're going to meet the challenge in 22 and 24. I know working with Governor Whitman every day gives me confidence, and I believe we can do it if we all come together again, irrespective of party, led by our wonderful state and local officials, as we did in 2020, with the full backing of a super majority of the American people who don't like this nonsense.
And I would agree with Norm 100% on this. We may not agree on everything 100%, but on this.
It would be so boring if we agreed on everything 100%.
Well, Governor Whitman, Ambassador Eisen, thank you so much for this evening. I can't imagine we could have had two better people to kick us off with our conversations on democracy. Thank you, everyone else who joined us for this evening. The next conversation on democracy will be on Monday, June 13th at 7 p.m. It will be in person and live. We'll live stream it on Facebook as well. It will be with a longtime conservative commentator and activist Bill Kristol. It's worth noting that the January 6th committee, which Ambassador Eisen just referenced, will be holding hearings throughout the month of June. So we'll be sure to have an interesting conversation on the 13th. I think one of the questions that we didn't get to reference the Tennessee legacy of our former Senator Howard Baker. I know that at least one of the members of the January 6th committee may be asking, what did the president know and when did he know it, in the spirit of Senator Baker's legacy. For a number of folks who've asked questions about the polling that we've done, the press releases that detail some of those numbers and detail the specific questions that we asked, those could be found at www.tndemocracy.org. You could also go there to register for June 13th. Please invite your friends to do so as well. Finally, for more on the efforts of the States United, please go to www.statesuniteddemocracy.org, and you could check out Norm Eisen's book, Overcoming Trumpery and the 7 Deadly Sins of Trumpery as well. So with that, again, thanks to everyone. Thank you, Tennessee, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.